Good afternoon and good morning, everyone. It's still morning. I'm going to go ahead and introduce Dr. Felipe Mercado. He is the coordinator in the Office of Clinical Practice at California State University in Fresno. He began his career as a social worker, and his research is focused on creating more equitable approaches to working with families of color or poverty in the child welfare arena. His research focused on creating more equitable approaches to working with families of color or poverty in the child welfare arena. In 2014, he became one of the first K-12 restorative practices counselors in California. He's had many roles, including elementary school principal, a middle school deputy principal, a counselor, a consultant, an adjunct professor for community colleges, and working in the state prison. Felipe has been mentored by Dr. Siri Sat Nam Singh and is trained in Dare to Lead, emotional intelligence, and compassion cultivation. He was named the CSU Fresno Health and Human Services Community Hero in 2019. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Felipe Mercado. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you so much, Margarita, and thank you so much, Lisa, as well, for having me here today. I want to thank everybody for joining us today. You know, it's really an honor to be able to share space with you all. When I thought about this presentation, I got really excited because I was like, you know, finally I can share my passion in an arena where I can be open and we can have honest dialogue. So I hope that, you know, today as we get to know each other a little bit better, that, you know, you're open to participate and that you're also able to gain something that you're able to take back into your own practice. Before we dive into any content, let me see if my thing will change. Here we go. We'll kind of talk about, you know, what lies ahead, so to speak, before we get into our journey. So today we'll have an overview, you know, of what our personal value is as far as, you know, when it comes to coaching, you know, what are our personal values. We'll also explore how coaching and supervising can transform K-12 teacher preparation. And we're going to look at this concept called the Wise Compassionate Framework. And we're going to see how it could promote social justice and equity in the classroom, as well as with our student teachers. And then we're going to also be able to start to apply that to our practice. So that way we can start to bring some theory to practice, so to speak. So as we start to dive in, you know, to kind of get our blood flowing and to get to know each other a little bit better, you know, if we could start to reflect on the following question. I'm going to lift up my bar really quick because I can't see the question on my screen. So the two questions are, what legacy do you hope to leave behind as a coach, supervisor, or leader? And why did you choose this role? I apologize, my thing's going a little wonky. And what is one thing you will do more to ensure you achieve your legacy in your practice? So when you think about your legacy, you know, what is the legacy you wish that you would leave behind? And, you know, what are some things that you would be able to do so that way you can ensure that you leave this type of legacy? What we're going to do is we're going to get into breakout rooms for about a total of 7 minutes. And what we'll do is we'll have groups of about 3 to 4. And what we'll have is introductions. If everybody can last about 2 to 3 minutes, introduce yourself and answering the following questions. And when we come back, if you can think about one word or one phrase that defines your legacy. So to sum it all up, we're going to get into breakout rooms for about 6 to 7 minutes. We're going to have groups of about 3 to 4, and we'll talk about, you know, what your legacy is and how you would how you hope to achieve that legacy. Also to introduce yourself, and then we'll come back. And as you come back, if you could have one word or one phrase that will capture your legacy. So we'll go into love, transform in equitable systems. I love that. Authenticity. You know, one of our participants talked about empowering future leaders. Empower, make change. Honey, inspire. Love without fear. Honesty. Humility. Challenge. Connector. Courage. Honesty. Unpack privilege. Intergenerational. You know what? These are all marvelous. And I want to thank you guys for really diving into your values. And I think it's only fair as we start to get to know each other and we get into, the work, that I share with you my legacy and what makes me tick. And a lot of what makes me tick is a lot of the words that you said: love, compassion, and equity, courage. When I was younger, I didn't always have the courage to have a voice. And I'm going to share with you a personal story because I think that personal narrative holds a lot of weight. And as I share with you my personal narrative, I hope that you can see what students might be facing inside the classroom, as well as what our student teachers might be facing. So I'm going to get into a video, and then I'll get into the next phase of my story.
The forensic pathologist who completed an autopsy on a teenage murder victim revealed new information about how he was killed, explaining to jurors Sammy Mercado had been shot at least one time at close range. That is our top story tonight, live at 5. Good evening, I'm Liz Harrison.
And I'm Warren Armstrong. Investigators say the 16-year-old was shot and...
But even so, doctors were able to see Mercado was shot through his clothing and also in the face. Dr. Venugopal went to the Orange Grove in October of 2012 to see the hole where Sammy Mercado was buried. He wanted to get a first-hand look at the scene and ensure all of the evidence would be collected and preserved as well as possible.
I visited the scene and participated in the excavation of the body, meaning the body was in a shallow grave and I had to take the body out.
Sammy Mercado disappeared 6 months before his body was discovered by Fresno County Sheriff's canine dogs 9 miles away from the marijuana grow where he was last seen. Sammy's friend testified Wednesday the group drove to the grow to steal some pot when Sammy was shot and killed. Ernie Chanmany is one of 3 suspects who investigators say was protecting the pot the morning of the murder. Detectives do not believe he is the shooter. Thursday, jurors were shown pictures of the grave and the remains in the state they were found. Sammy's clothing was the most identifiable and did have some gunshot holes in it. His face, although only skeletal remains, had an obvious wound.
What he's telling you is a bullet has entered here and basically come off on the right side of the face.
2 other witnesses who had...
So Sammy Mercado was my brother, and when Sammy passed away, he got kicked out of school. He got kicked out of high school. He went to continuation, got kicked out of continuation, got kicked out of independent study. And so he wasn't going to school. And so by default, he started hanging around with other people that didn't go to school, and these are the things that happened. The reason I share with you that background is because me and Sammy grew up in the same family. We have the same mom with the same dad. And unfortunately for me, I was able to see kind of what my parents were, before they had my brother. And, for me, I started my life in an incubator, right? My mom and my dad, both did some drugs, which caused me to be in an incubator for several months. So not being able to be held and loved when we talk about trauma, right? Like those things, were impacting my life before I was even born due to the decisions my parents made. Some of the first memories that I have as a child was, my mom and my dad were fighting. I was about 4 or 5 years old, and my dad picks up my mom and slams her through this glass table, and she gets up and she's bleeding from her elbows. And I'm young, and I don't really understand life too much yet, right? I'm 4 or 5 years old, and she's bleeding so much that I thought she was gonna die. And I remember my parents yelling at me and telling me to go to my room. And when I came out of my room, my parents were drinking and they were smoking. That was kind of my life, every single day as I grew up. When I was in kindergarten, my dad was locked up. My mom had some mental health issues. So when I would come home, there was really nobody to come home to. And life was a little bit difficult because I was like this little kid who wanted to do good, but I didn't really know how to do good. And so as I got into 2nd grade, my dad had got out of jail. We were on Section 8 and we were living in hotels. And, life for me was just one of those things where I would come home every day and my parents were fighting and I didn't really know how to be happy. When I would go to school, I felt like I was always being judged, because, I didn't dress well or I talked a certain way, I spoke Spanish as my first language. So I wasn't an English speaker, when I came into, kindergarten. And because of that, people made fun of me. And I think sometimes some of my teachers even undervalued me. And I was able to feel that, as a child. By the time, I was in, 15 years old, I found myself homeless and in juvenile hall. I was kicked out of my freshman year, and I didn't have a family to go to. I got kicked out not only my freshman year and my sophomore year, as well as my junior year. And I was on a path for destruction. You know, I was making a lot of bad decisions. And my senior year, I was about to go to a SARB 3 meeting where I was going to get kicked out of school because I had missed so many days of school, but they didn't realize I was homeless and that I was trying to come to school because I wanted to come to school and do good, but I just didn't have the resources to come to school. And fortunately, you know, there was this one incident that happened in my classroom, you know, and this is something I really want to hone in when we talk about, you know, coaching and teacher preparation, is the ripple effect that teachers could have, right? So this teacher, Miss Johnstone in the orange, right? This is me in the black trying to be cool with my hat, right? Like, that's what I thought I was, right, at the time. And so this teacher, Miss Johnstone, calls me, you know, after class one day, because we had to write a scrapbook. And so the scrapbook had 5 essays. And so the 5 essays were like your first disappointment, your first family vacation, you know, the first time you came into the high school and what you thought, things of that nature, right? And she asked me to stay after class, you know, after I had written the scrapbook. And, you know, I had tried my best, so I'm like, man, you know, here I go again. I'm going to get reamed, you know, for not doing a good job because there was just requirements and I didn't have a computer and I didn't have the right printer and the ink. So everything didn't come out the way it was supposed to. So here I am thinking I'm going to get in trouble. And as she calls me after class, and I remember it like it was yesterday, you know, she tells me, you know, I never knew you were going through what you were going through. And I was like, what do you mean? You know, she starts telling me, as I was reading your essays and, you know, just piecing things together, I always knew you were different. And it wasn't bad that you were different. It's just that I didn't know why you were different. And as I'm reading your stories, you know, like, it makes all this sense to me why you are the way that you are. And I want to help you, but I just don't know how. And so that was the first time that a teacher had ever approached me and had that approach with me. She hooked me up with a school psychologist. And as I was going through the SARB 3 meeting, her and my school psychologist sat down with me and advocated with me and said, hey, this student is homeless, he's smart. They got letters of recommendations from other teachers. That way I could stay in school. Because of that experience, you know, I was able to become a principal. And, you know, you heard kind of some of my accomplishments that I've had, you know, in my past before I become a coordinator. And, you know, as I was a student, one thing I want to call out was, you know, that happened. You know, my brother Sammy had passed away, right? And he was missing for 6 months while I was in my internship. And it was my university coach and it was my coordinator, right, that made modifications so that way I could still succeed. So when we talk about, you know, our impact, right, in practice, right, as far as coaches, as far as supervisors go, you know, I want you to think about Miss Johnstone, and I want you to really start to understand that you're cultivating, right? Like, if you're the water, like, and the teachers are the seeds, right? You're watering our teachers to be the Miss Johnstones. And let me tell you, there was a lot of teachers in my life that weren't like Miss Johnstone. And those teachers, you know, I remember vividly. And I have bad experiences with those teachers. And as I go back, you know, I start to think, why did those teachers not have, you know, the tools that Miss Johnstone did? And that's why, for me, I'm so passionate about teacher preparation, because my question is, how do we get more Miss Johnstones out in the world? Because we need them, right? We need people to be compassionate, to see people, not just for the academics, right? But for the whole person that they are. There's a lot of kids out there that struggle with trauma, just like I did, right? Because their parents did drugs and because of all these decisions that were beyond their control. And they come to school and they get judged for it. And it's so hard for them to thrive academically. So it takes teachers to really be able to feel a whole child. And in order for us to really start to cultivate social justice and equity, right, in schools, in K-12 education. So my question to you is, in your role, how can you help create more Miss Johnstones and ensure that student teachers gain the knowledge and skills that they need to be successful in today's classrooms and schools? We're going to get into breakout rooms. I'm looking at time, so we'll do maybe about 5 minutes, and we'll do breakout rooms of about 3 or 4. And if you guys can just reflect on, you know, in my role, you know, how can I help create more teachers like Miss Johnstone? You know, when I think about Felipe's story, how can I ensure that more teachers touch and impact students so that way students can have a better life? So when we talk about the WISE compassionate framework, it really talks about, it stems from the idea more that, you know, our student teachers need more in order for them to be, successful in their teacher preparation, as well as beyond their teacher preparation. We noticed that in research that, student teachers, when they enter the profession, they don't stay in the profession very long. And what we're finding is that, our student teachers don't always have all the resources and trainings that they needed in order for them to be successful. And as we start to look at coaches and even some of our training ourselves, we start to see that there's all these nuances that are out there in the 21st century with post-COVID and trauma-informed practices. And these nuances weren't things that we knew. So we needed to have a framework such as the Wise Compassionate Framework that really starts to help guide us understand what our student teachers will need in order for them to be successful. When we talk about this framework, it was birthed off the idea of multi-tier system of support. We wanted to make the idea very similar to what a lot of the districts and schools are using. So we didn't want to have this uncommon language. We wanted to make sure we had common language. And when we look at multi-tier system support that looks at the whole child, one of the things is they emphasize on data, but the bigger picture is that they really want to look at the whole child. And so rather than just looking at the academic needs, they also want to look at the social emotional learning needs of the child, as well as the behavioral needs. And the way that I look at this is that traditionally we've always looked at academics as the kind of one size fits all that's going to help the student. But what this framework in MTSS calls out, and that's why the two pyramids are here on the side, social, emotional, and behavior, is because they're kind of like the crutches that we can't get to academic success without, understanding the social, emotional elements and behavior elements of the student. But before we even get into the framework, there's some foundations that our student teachers need to know. So within the social emotional learning framework, right, some of our foundations for students are understanding how to activate a positive support group and sustain self-care. That's very important because if you don't know how to have self-care for yourself, right, and these things are happening, then how do you continue to thrive in your profession? You also have to have a background in multi-tier system support, for instance, in the social emotional learning component. These foundational items help you get into the work in the universal, supplemental, and intensive tiers of the social emotional element, so to speak, because you have that background. A lot of times what we see, and even as a principal, is that if you don't have this background, that you'll get into doing some of this work, but if you're not trauma informed or you don't understand multi-systems of support, then you're just collecting data. And sometimes you're harming more students than actually helping them. So having the background of understanding why the neuroscience is very important. And the same thing in the behavioral element, right? In the behavioral element, understanding why do we do trauma-informed practices? When we talk about restorative practices and all these new approaches, sometimes it's very hard for us to buy into these approaches because we live in a society where we punish, and that's what we see. And so for us to really understand trauma-informed practices, to be mental health competent and racially responsive, helps us start to see why we need to have these different approaches. So then when a student does do whatever they do, rather than us kind of having our traditional punitive approach, we know that we need to have a different approach. And not only do we know that, we have the skills to be able to operate for that student to be able to thrive in that behavior element, whether it's progress monitoring or whatever that student might need. Also, within the academic components, a lot of our student teachers, they don't really understand how to be within a PLC process, how to utilize their voice. So even though they know what a PLC is, or they might know how to collect data, they don't really feel comfortable talking to teachers who have been there for 15 years, who might have traditional practices and are trying to, maybe the newer teacher is trying to talk about these newer practices, right? And so teachers, if they don't have that advocacy or that comfortability or that skill, a lot of times, they'll leave the profession, they'll burn out, or they'll get skills that they know that aren't good because everybody else is telling them to do it, to like maybe discipline a student like this or to teach like this, and it goes against their uniqueness. And that's why people burn out, and get demoralized. And, I heard today from Margarita, or burnt out from the profession. And so this framework really just helps us start to see all the components within teacher preparation that our student teachers need, and helps our coaches, understand how to start to advocate and have conversations with our student teachers to ensure that when our student teachers leave, that they have these things in place. Because that's the way that our student teachers are going to be able to sustain themselves in this profession with everything going on. I hope I did justice.
Beautiful.
Dr. Mercado, quick question.
Yes.
Being thinking this is very MTSS. And I'm used to the PBIS tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 components. So I'm assuming on this framework right now, your universal is your tier 1, your supplemental is tier 2, and your intensive is tier 3.
That is correct, yes. So MTSS is basically PBIS, and then the concept from RTI, they call it PBIS and RTI squared. So they're basically trying to bring both of those two elements together. So it would be basically the same elements that you're talking about. The only difference is, rather than calling it tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3, tier 1 is universal, tier 2 is supplemental, and tier 3 is intensive.
Thank you.
You're very welcome.
And Dr. Mercado, thank you so much for explaining that. As I look at the foundations for student teachers, how would you recommend that, so when I share this image with student teachers, would you recommend that the foundations for student teachers, like that they try to develop these skills like concurrently as they are exploring like universal supports and, some of the other areas?
Yes, I would really try to see, if I'm a student teacher, right, in a perfect world, I would like to talk about, how do you infuse social skills programming curriculum that teaches character and positive behavior? How is that being done? Are you doing that academically? Do you have a social skills curriculum? How is that being done within your practice? And if it's not being done in your practice, how would you consider, these things being done? How would you have conversation? Maybe as a student teacher, you can ask, can I run a group? Because I'm thinking about running a social emotional group, in my practice. And so I want to start to get, this experience and seeing if maybe you can get some of the tier 2 and tier 3s and run a small group in the back with the student teacher. So that way they can start to get their advocacy in a second step curriculum or whatever it may be. What I'm noticing is that a lot of times our student teachers might know the knowledge, but they don't have the experience, the experiential part. And so for them to be able to practice the SST, right? One of the biggest things, that we're noticing is that not everybody does an SST. So we're looking at the university. How do we have mock SSTs? How do we have mock 504s? So that way we ensure that our student teachers, know how to do these things and they feel comfortable writing a 504 and doing an SST and infusing, social skills content into their day-to-day practice. A lot of times, their mentor teacher didn't have that experience and, our coaches or our universities aren't pushing them, then they're not going to develop this. But at the same time, when we look at MTSS and best practices out in K-12 education, this is what they're asking for from our teachers. And a lot of times our teachers struggle because they don't have that foundation. So I look at it, if they have this foundation, they get that experience. When they get into the profession, it becomes kind of like second nature, just like anything else does.
Amy, just to add on to what Dr. Mercado said and listening to what he's saying, I think I agree with him, if we do introduce this to our student teachers, when they go into the classroom, if there are more of those on-site interventions and supports, then we're going to have less tier 3 students. I also work in student services. I do CWA. So I'm at the tier 3 SAR meetings where I deal with the students and I'm like, oh my goodness, this is laid out. If more of our teachers knew why we have these interventions and supports in place, then I wouldn't have to see so many students at SAR meetings.
And that's an excellent point. I used to, when I was a restorative practices counselor, I worked out of the Department of Prevention and Intervention. So everything that I try to do is preventative, right? And so when we look at MTSS, that's what we look at is, we know that kids are coming in with trauma, and rather than, blaming the parents and doing all these things, which we could do, let's just figure out what we can do to adapt and to be flexible, because our kids are going to come in the way that they come in. Let alone with COVID. I'm stressed out sometimes. I know you guys might be stressed out sometimes, let alone a parent in poverty, right? And so when all these elements going, right, and then a student coming in the class, it's very important for us to have different approaches that are going to help us be successful, and not just us, but that student. Because also when we look at that student, that human being, we know by 3rd grade, if that student doesn't know how to read and comprehend, that they're probably building a jail for them. Or if we have the ripple effect of like the Miss Johnstone, then they can become a principal and get a doctorate's degree, right? And so this is the trajectories that we're trying to build, and sometimes we don't really see. But in order for us to be successful in our work, we have to know what we don't know. And in our teacher preparations, we weren't taught all of these things. And that's okay. We have to have compassion with ourselves and be like, I don't have to have an ego and know everything, but if I know what I don't know and how to get, and that's what I learned in social work, right? I don't have to know everything, but if I can get the client what they need and network them, then we're good, right? I don't have to have the right answer here, but I'm going to get you the right answer. And this is what we need to start doing, right, in our profession. And that's how we bring equity and social justice. It's not just a concept or approach, it's an action, right?
I love it.
So I know I spoke a lot. What I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of give you an opportunity to bring theory to practice. In breakout rooms, if you could please answer the following questions. How would you use the WISE Compassionate Framework in your practice to help advocate for student teachers, to have conversations with important stakeholders, as well as what would you add to the framework? You know, when you look into the framework, you know, what are things that you see that are missing? How can you be more responsive to the needs of your student teachers from what you learned today? So in your discussion rooms, we'll do groups of 4 to 5, and we'll do, as I'm looking at time, we'll do about 4 minutes, and then we'll come back. Lunch is near the horizon, and we have about 3 or 4 minutes with each other to finalize the last, you know, kind of section of the presentation. You know, I don't know if you were able to see the framework in the discussion room, but one of the things that I'm going to make sure that I do is to upload my PowerPoint, so that way you have access to that framework if you would like to see it and you utilize it in your practice. But as we get into the last section, you know, these are some three reflection questions that I left, as well as if you would like to talk about anything from the framework or from the discussion group that you just were a part of. This is our time, right? I wanted to provide us at least 5-10 minutes for us to dialogue, and if you leave you any space if you had any questions. So here's 3 questions that I posed, as well as if you have anything that you would like to add from the presentation or from your discussion group. Right now is a great time. Well, at least, do you feel like this would be useful in your practice?
Definitely, definitely useful, yeah. Dr. Mercado, this is excellent. Excellent tools helping us to reflect on all the different components about, you know, teaching the whole child, right? It's not just the content. We're talking about the emotional well-being of children, everything. Helping remind us about, you know, all the different accommodations and modifications, culturally relevant pedagogy.
Thank you, Susanna.
I think this is very useful. And we were talking about actually, the person I was talking with talked about taking it into your sessions with your teacher practitioner and leaving it with them. So in case they have problems, they can go back and say, oh, well, this is a tool I can use to figure out how to help my students. So I really appreciate this.
Thank you for sharing that, Pat. I didn't think of that. That's a great idea.
And it wasn't my idea. I just can't remember the person's name who told it to me. Maybe he'll jump in and say it.
Well, thank you for having the conversation with that person if you don't jump in.
That was Orlando. Thank you, Dr. Mercado. Great presentation, very valuable. And even though you said it, it seems like a lot, like I can really use this in my coursework to be able to, do it something like where we come up with a sample scenario with the student. Now that we ask the student teachers, create a 3-prong, behavioral approach to working with that student, so that students practice using all 3 part of the diagram, so they could have it right. That's how I would use it. And I just want to say one more thing, that my presentation that's coming up next really builds off what you laid out. So I like to see that there's going to be synergy there.
Yes, well, I look forward to it. That means I'm going to have to attend.
Trying to have the opposite effect, but yeah.
Well, if you would like to have any questions, my email is here. I also have my mailing address. I also have a website if you want to stay in contact. But, you know, for me, I just thank you for being here. You know, I really do believe that the power and the ripple effect that you have in your practice sometimes goes unnoticed, right? And similar to even me, when I was in my internship, if it wasn't for my coordinator, if it wasn't for my university coach making the accommodations for me, so that way when my brother, you know, was missing, I wouldn't have maybe been in the profession. I would have probably quit or maybe been somewhere else, right? My trauma might have impacted me, but because I had that support, you know, I was able to thrive. And now I have this lens and this story to tell others, right? And so, you know, just think about the impact that you have every day that you walk into, you know, your practice, because sometimes I think that we forget. So thank you so much. And I wish you all a beautiful day. And I'll stick around if anybody has any questions or if they would like to ask me anything directly.
Thank you, Dr. Mercado. So great to meet you.
Thank you, Lisa.